Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm going to walk you through the role of planning, budgeting, and forecasting as part of the closed consolidation reporting cycle. Here's a brief bio about myself. As you can see, I'm a subject matter in many different disciplines. I have a balance between 15 plus years in corporate reporting, analysis, planning, budgeting, and forecasting, and another close to 15, 16 years doing financial solutions. So I've worked with companies across industry and geography, driving the best decisions based on data. Um, Overall, I'm just going to walk you through different aspects of the budgeting, forecasting, planning cycle. As you can see from this particular thing, now I can be very succinct and clear here. So the annual budgeting process typically for companies starts around after the second quarter in June with the development of the models or the updates. Now some of those models may be still be based in Excel. Some of them may be used as part of working with OLAP data sources with an Excel add-in. But in general, basically, you're going to see here, you're setting goals and basically then you're moving out. Most cases, the budgeting cycle is based around revenue forecasting, OPEX forecasting. It's it's looking at workforce planning. It's looking at capital planning. It's looking at cash flow management. Those are the critical aspects of the budgeting cycles themselves. What you do is you establish at the top level, which is your corporate level of targets, and then you push it down to the business unit level that they have responsibility. So typically at a business unit level, you're really only budgeting for your sales, your margin and operational expenses up to a certain point. And some of the key metrics that you're going to be using are inventory turns, accounts receivable, sales per day. The reason I say that is that from the balance sheet perspective, on a business unit level, a lot of the balance sheet accounts are not carried all the way down to a business unit level. Now, this is a good one. I'm not sure I'd call it an incremental budget, but traditional budgeting basically started what we called was a baseline. And I mentioned earlier about you start year to date June and then you project out. So you're really basically using that baseline to forecast out where you're going to hit. Now, what'll happen in there is you'll have some assumptions around sales pricing, sales increases, wage increases. You look at operational expenses on the inflationary target. You'll look at certain specific things that you'll use as part of what we'll call as assumptions that will go into it. And all you're doing is basically doing it down and dirty method of forecasting out. Now, what it'll allow companies to do is, as you're forecasting at a business unit level, depending on how you're organized, to meet with individuals to go over their individual budget. Whether that's remotely, whether that's within meetings, it just is going to depend on how you organize the structure and how you're sharing data. This is the key thing here is in terms of incremental. It's basically looking at run rates and forecasting those run rates out. And then explaining any differences that you need to adjust for example, one-time charges. Activity-based model budgeting is really getting into more driver base. So if you're looking at key aspects of your retail locations, you could be looking at pickup versus delivery in terms of how you're allocating costs. It's really looking at assigning based on activity. And this really comes back to looking at profitability and looking at your business unit level and driving the best way in terms of the allocation of the resources based on the activity you're achieving. Value proposition budgeting. This is just going beyond the incremental time. I wouldn't necessarily call it value proposition budget. I would just call it more scrutinization of what you're doing. That you're basically going line by line on sales planning, workforce planning, capital planning to do all the justification as part of the roll up into your business unit level up to your geographically location up to eventually to your consolidation that reports up to like a controller or a FP&A manager that does the roll-ups. Zero base is seldom used. It's usually used when you're specifically faced with a scenario. And we're seeing that right now with companies dealing with in general, the issues around uh, terror threats or market conditions. It's critical to understand what those threats are. But it's basically you're scrutinize every line and you're starting from zero and you're building it up. It's a very involved process. I've in my career haven't used it very often. The only time I've used it is if we're doing an acquisition or a new product line or something that we have no history on, and we're going to do something as a zero based on. Driver base is the big one. My clients and customers have used this all along because it's more accurate in terms of the forecasting because you're basically looking at specific drivers for a customer. You're looking specific drivers for OPEX, capital spending, and workforce. That's key variables that are driving the impact. Integrated business planning, as it says, it is more involved. It's basically more strategic. It's because you're basically looking at a long-term approach to your business. So you're really driving out all the variables that are going to impact that business. And it's the approach that a lot of my clients, especially the large scale companies, do is because they want to integrate all aspects of their business operation into the planning cycle because they want a clear, concise plan, both on the short term and the long term of how they're going to achieve their metrics and what are some of the factors that are going to drive those metrics. As you can see here, the annual budget process, it looks at scope, horizon, focus, collaboration, flexibility, decision making. As you can see with the annual, it's primary financial, it's fixed terms, it's short-term financial goals because typically the annual budget is basically it's a commitment. It's a commitment you're making to the board of what you're going to achieve, but it's a moment in time. But if you look at integrated, it's both operational, final, and it's looking at longer term 24, 36. A lot of companies still do this anyways. They'll have a 1, 3, and 5, but the longer the time frame out, the less rigid it is in terms of things. They'll probably just do high level views on that. This kind of gives you an idea of a driver base because I basically looked at financial resources, operation, cost, and revenue. This kind of looks at how you're going to forecast things out. This is where it gets more involved in terms of people involved. So if you've got production facilities, you're going to be working with the plant managers and stuff like that to look at their input costs, raw material, labor, overhead. If you're looking at revenue, you're going to be looking at your pricing strategy. You're going to be looking at product launches. You're going to be looking at all that. HR, you're going to be looking at your head count. You're going to be looking at wage increases. You're going to be looking at just an aspect around onboarding, recruiting. So it's a whole aspect of that. And financial, this is where you're getting into integrating the balance sheet and cash flow. Now, a lot of organizations do a high-level balance sheet that because they need some of the metrics around days sales outstanding, inventory turns, or other key metrics that are driving their conversations into their meetings with the board of directors and other senior managers. Rolling forecast is very critical. It's always been used by my clients. It's basically as one month jumps off, you add a new month, and it's just constantly with part of the forecasting cycle because the budget's already set in stone, but each month you have to do a rolling forecast in terms of where you're going to hit each quarter and by the year end forecast as well. This gives you an idea in terms of the processes itself in terms of what you do in the forecasting cycle. Typically, you fill out a template, and this is your commitment of where you're at, where you're going to head to, and you probably might have some notes back in terms of maybe it's a big customer deal you're signing, maybe it's expansion of a new location, maybe it's looking at some optimization you're doing, but you're going to get specifically on targeting exercise a specific business process change or is what you're planning to do in terms of other structural changes. Can't overemphasize driver base because as it says it's more of a link. It gives you more visibility in the data and the variations with that data, and that's critical. When you look at driver base, there's some challenge. Most cases it is more making sure the drivers are right I've always recommended to my clients to review these drivers consistently to make sure that they make sense. Just to give you a little bit more clarity around tying it to the operational results. Like any sort of budgeting, you're going to need to ensure you have clear objectives and scope. The granularity of your planning is very critical. Like the more granular you get, the more involved that process can be. It also creates some issues in terms of the overall model design. Because if you're dealing with, say, a 10,000 SKU stocking SKU, it's going to have a lot more performance issues as you roll it up or make changes. So it's very important to understand that. Defining the data coming in terms of the actual baseline is critical. And just looking at the overall process of how you stage that data, because a lot of companies like to update their data based on actuals every month just to see where they're heading to test out their assumptions. Leveraging AI and predictable stuff, you're starting to see more and more of that. That can be leveraging Python or other tools to leverage different variables that give you a bit more control or more insight in terms of sales forecasting, OPEX spend, OPEX, or other areas of your planning cycle. And continuous improvement, as I said, the budget itself is cast in stone, but it does not necessarily mean that in general that you're not constantly looking at things. Over my career, and you might have different terminologies, we use gap analysis all the time because you had your budget column, you had your actual, and then you had a gap between where you're at your budget. And then you basically were coming up to how you're closing that gap or what is your new forecast, and you're making adjustments. So it's always about basically continuous monitor because you're going to be measured on your targets, your bonus and compensations are all going to be targeted at. Plus management's making a commitment each quarter what they're going to hit and what they're going to do at the year end. So we're in an era now with what's going on with the states at the time I did this video on tariffs and impacts of those tariffs. So a lot of companies are throwing out their year forecast just because of the uncertainties. They're just going quarter to quarter because they want to understand the impact of the policies. It's not necessarily just with the US. There's other geopolitical events and risks that are happening as well. This gives you some ideas of the other challenges: accuracy, collection, data-driven insights. These are all part of just overall confidence in terms of the data. Process, the more rigid you make these budget process, and it's becoming less on that because companies are starting to realize they invest a lot of time of 3 months to come up with a budget, but the next day that budget can go out the door due to a certain event. So what you're looking at doing is doing the right level of budgeting where it makes the most sense. This gives you some other ideas in terms of communication and just the overall challenges. Now, one of the key aspects that you're seeing happen now is, and I've seen this quite a bit over the last 18 months to 2 years, there's a lot of people out there consulting, and I get that. You're trying to promote your own ability to help companies drive results, but a lot of cases they're overcomplicating the budget forecasting planning cycle. In some cases they're emphasizing Excel, and I'm a heavy Excel user, but I'm also a realist. And in terms of what you're trying to do with basically with the data and doing some of these work, you have to decide how best to basically plan this data and what to do it. And you may use a combination of OLAP tools as well as Excel to kind of drive this stuff, especially when you're doing the forecasting cycle. And a lot of the tools will have what's called as a sandbox. You create these different sandbox and scenarios, and then you leverage them. So it's critical to kind of look at these things as part of the value added that you're doing, because at the end of the day, you've got to produce information around your forecast, and those forecasts have to be validated as you're having discussion with the FP&A team, up to the controllers and up to the CFO, because at the end of the day, you're driving performance. Manual processes, this is the one thing that's changing quite a bit. The old days, you used to have to dump things in Excel and crunch them, and then rely on the data coming in. Sometimes you're dumping stuff from a CSV file in Excel and the manipulation. The other issue you want is version control, and that's very critical. Is you may have it during the month end, and is you may go with an initial forecast that's rejected, and you're going to have a different version of the next one they come back to you in terms of the commitment. So there's version control that you want to have as well. This just gives you a bit more examples of, in the past, a lot of the budgeting was based on time series, historical data, and trends. We're now able to leverage more what I call a smarter planning, to leverage the AI piece to bring in a little bit more confidence window into terms of things, right? But the reality is this is anything you do in it, and you want to make sure that you have a strong understanding of the best modeling practices. Uh, Poor model design isn't going to be fixed just because you move from Microsoft Excel to OLAP or FP&A solution. At the end of the day, you still want to emphasize best practices when you're modeling. Scalability, this is critical. Like when you're looking at things, your user base, the larger it is, the more you want to be able to scale accordingly in terms of how you're working with the data and to drive the best business decisions. I'm a big user of Excel add-ins. Now, most third parties, whether it's an ERP system, whether it's an FP&A solution, and you're seeing Profix listed here. Profix is not by far not the only one doing this kind of work. That being said, basically most companies have add-ins. The problem with add-ins is a lot of cases is Excel doesn't work well with multiple add-ins. So there's a lot of work where you have to act, enable or disable an add-in. So a lot of companies are looking at what type of add-ins that they want their users to have and how often do they refresh those add-ins. This gives you a bit more of this. Now again, this is not an all-inclusive list. You're seeing data rails on here, which is a fairly new solution. You're seeing Cube 2, which is fairly new as well. But a lot of these ones are basically more predominantly based on an Excel add-in, not as much with a web interface. I just added a few more ones. I've worked predominantly with planning analytics over the years. I have colleagues of mine working with OneStream Board and Planful. I'm not here to choose what solution is better. If you are looking at an FP&A solution, it's really up to the discretion of yourself and your steering committees to decide what's the best solution for you. Gets into some BA tools now. Part of the reason why people are moving to BA tools is, this is a good couple lines here. One is you can automate a lot of the processes. You can create what we call our jobs. You can create stuff that loads into a staging database or an ODBC connection, but you can refresh the data quicker. Now, I'm not saying Excel is not good for that. It's just that with large sums of data, BA tools work a lot better, especially when you're dealing with complexity with intersection points of revenue or capital planning or other areas where you have some complexity. This gives you a good idea in terms of scenario planning, performance tracking. It gives you some more insight. A lot of the solutions you'll see with it will have an administration console, which basically gives you some visibility on the application's performance, security management, data connections, all this stuff around that. Even audit stuff, like there could be transaction logs. There could be other logs in terms of last change, especially when you're starting to do workflow management on the approval side. You want to see what changes are happening. Basically, this is a good point, but it doesn't mean Excel can't do faster decision. It just means that depending on how you scale Excel, if you're dealing with simplified budgeting forecasting cycles, then by all means Excel is going to be pretty fast, and you can streamline it, or what we call is cut down that model size to what you need to do. But the larger, the more complex modeling, and I've worked with some large retailers that do a lot of merchandise planning, and their models are going to be fairly sizable. I've worked with logistics companies around tracking stuff around their business units. And again, they have some complexity there as well. So the larger the organization, or in some cases the enterprise, the more they want an enterprise-based solution. Cost savings, if you have to do a lot of manual work and if you have to do a lot of things where you're loading stuff, you need to be, cognizant of how best to do that. Because at the end of the day, there's critical times for the forecasting cycle. Because I can come from experience. We usually were working in a 5 to 6 day window that, from the accounting perspective, we were closing the books. The analyst can do some work up to it, but they still rely on a closed GL to basically take data from that. Then usually they're allowed to talk to the accountant, so if there's some adjustments or something like that, they're able to see it. They're not allowed in most cases to make journal entries because that would be a segregation of duty issue. But basically, it's all about pulling that data together. In the past, when in 1995, when I was with Praxair, what we did is we leveraged Cognos PowerPlay at the time, which was an OLAP source. And I built key analytical procedures when I was looking at retail stores as part of my month-end close to do some testing. Now, I was responsible for doing a reporting package after the close, but eventually we started transitioning, hiring financial analysts to drive that more because we wanted them within the business unit so they were more familiar with the business to drive it. So basically, it's all critical about collaboration and working with the right tools that will drive the best results. This gives you just about a bit more about scaling. I've seen a lot of issues around modeling practices, and I've recommended you want to have the right balance between what you use for business rules and what you use for feeding data. So you want to, the more intensive you build a model of rules, the more it can have an issue with performance depending on the sizing of your data set. So if you look at a revenue side, if you've got a large inventory stocking SKUs, it's going to have an impact in terms of how the calculation's going to get done. Payroll, it's similar to that. Depending on your workforce base, it's going to have to calculate from additions, salary increases, and forecast it out. Capital planning too, you may have to be involved where you have to do an NPV calculation to justify the capital. So it's all about basically looking at how you scale this. You can model anything, you still need to understand how the modeling rules around cash flow projection and make sure that you embrace those modeling practices at any sort of scaling and build out of any model in terms of design. Now, here's some just good examples of this. Now, this list is not all inclusive. There could be a few things, but I just highlighted from my experience of working with business partners and clients over the years is modeling capabilities. A lot of cases you want a rules editor that it's very intuitively, but mostly easy to access it. I've seen over my career where they tried to use different tools, but they weren't embraced. Like a seasoned modeler using a tool is okay with a certain approach of building things. The ability to interact Excel, too much time has gone on about trying to replace Excel. That's just not going to happen. That's just not realistic. So the reality is this, that you need to work with that space and work out best to leverage Excel in terms of how you're rolling out your solution. Managing data. A lot of cases, organizations don't want IPs or ports open. The reason why that, for security reasons, there's day doesn't go by you don't see some sort of cybersecurity issue come up or crop up. So you may see situations where you stage that data into a SQL Oracle database and you have an option to run a job or a chore to refresh that data. Web interfaces. A lot of cases solutions will have, so you can use Chrome is the preferred way to use a web base and work with widgets within that grid experience. Again, it doesn't change or negate that you need to have best practices or how you design in terms of how you embed within there, from charts to a template and just the overall design of it. Security level, again, this gets down to the level of security you put on a unit, an element, a cube, just the overall visibility, especially when you're dealing with HR related and other information that's of sensitive nature. Performance and overall application health, I always recommend at least once a year you should do your own health check and periodically work with your business partner to have them do a review as well. Integration with BI tools, so a lot of tools themselves will produce the data, but clients may also have the BI tool, the business intelligence, which is far better for doing dashboarding scorecards like Power BI, Tableau, Cognos Analytics, or other tools. Audit trail is big. I mentioned that earlier, is around transactional log, last change, especially when you're starting to look at in critical phases the forecasting, budgeting, and planning cycle. What changes made, who made it, and workflow. This is like basically creating an approval, rejection, and all that is part of the budget thing. Now, a lot of solutions in my past, um, the emphasis wasn't necessary so much in the workflow management, but that's becoming more critical now. And products are embracing more workflow, building that workflow management within their solution. This kind of gives you an idea around applications AI and financial modeling. If you look at debt repayment prediction, churn's a big issue, right? Because when you're looking at your sales growth on accounts, you're looking at how much is going to churn each year, how can you mitigate that? You're looking at stock market because you're looking at your shareholder value and your capital allocation. Compliance and regulatory reporting, that's as complex as you can get from ESG reporting or other mandates around local GAAP or IFRS. You need to be doing that. Predictability analytics is becoming pretty critical around the sale forecasting, inventory management, supply chain, and you're not going to avoid doing you're integrating scenario and sensitivity analysis as part of your budgeting, forecasting, and planning and analysis cycle. This kind of gets in. Now, this list isn't all inclusive where you do this. There's different allocation, but building out any sort of intelligence into it means really thinking it out in terms of modeling. What are you trying to accomplish, and does it make sense in terms of what the results is? So you want to validate those results all the time. This gives you kind of a little bit more application of AI in finance, dynamic cash flow, modeling of revenue, expenses, and profitability, uncertainty because we're starting to deal with more and more geopolitical events. What happens, for example, if you have a strike? What happens if you have a situation where a weather event hits you? You want to do this. Real-time financial forecasting. Now, I wouldn't say it's real time, I'd say it's near real time because there's always going to be an option that you're going to have to do a refresh, and that refresh can take a little bit. It's not instantaneously, there's a little bit of a gap. And you want to automate things where it makes sense because you're basically looking at ways to mitigate where you have to have manual intervention. So that automating parts of the financial forecasting cycle is critical. Well, that's standard. If you go look at some of the models in Google, the searches, you've got units, you tie them by a price, right? And maybe you have contract pricing in there, but you're basically developing the models and basically how you're driving them to automate it. And then you may have a situation where you only go up and adjust the assumptions cube, or you make specifically sandbox work and you make those adjustments as part of saving the sandbox, and then you make those within the model itself or the tools that you have, the changes you're able to make. So here's some tips and tricks that I would recommend with people. Avoid bad modeling practices. That means overfeeding, too complex rule models. Always work with design documents in terms of revenue planning, OPEX spending, wherever you're working with driver base to build them is. When we used to roll out projects, we used to have a design document that we would use as part of the overall, like a sales cube or capital, workforce, all the major cubes and models we would have as the design document. Sizing exercise. This is where it comes to what level of granularity are you budgeting at, and does it make sense to do it at that level, because that's critical once you do that, because as you're building your roll-ups in the flow, it's going to be based on the level of granularity and how you feed that data all the way up to eventually your reporting cube, which is your income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. I always recommend scenario planning now. That's a given now, because the scenarios you're going through. Plus, it ties into that on your forecasting cycle. You have to do some gap analysis, and that all feeds into it. That so line one, where I say scenario and gap analysis, is critical. Defining the metrics. So you're going to define the metrics at a corporate level, because the balance sheet rolls up in that, and you're going to define the metrics at the business unit level. So you have comparisons data, so you can compare data that's comparable, and that means like day sales outstanding, inventory turn, sales per day, sales per employee, other efficiencies in metrics that make sense at a business unit level. Now, you don't want to have 50 metrics. You may want to target specific metrics. I also recommend always working with a qualified business partner to actually support you in your journey. They may help with the training. They may even provide you situations where they can sign deals with you for support to help you with your model design and stuff like that, to provide you expertise from their experience of that. So it could be a support agreement. You also want to define your schedule for upgrading tools, whether that's the Excel add-in, whether that's your the platform, or the what we would call as the core components, the server, um, the web, just other areas. Now, depending on the organization, the cadence can be every 60 days, it could be every quarter, it could be once a year. I think it's going to depend on the organization that you're dealing with and where they are with that. There doesn't mean they don't always enhance those products. They just may not release those enhancements for a quarter, because it's an involved process to go with the enhancements because of the regression process. Plus, also too, they also may have fixes, but those fixes you can work with a client, especially if it's causing your application to go down. They can put a hot site together and put fixes up there. Is that the other issue I've always recommended I put on this list is basically um, always have best practices, tips and technique documents. Sometimes the vendor will have them itself. They might see some videos, but these are pretty good ways to ensure that you're keeping your application performing at its highest level. Now, budgeting forecasting are a key part of the fiscal cycle for public-private sector organization. How involved they are is really dependent on the organization itself in terms of where it is and how it leverages the forecasting and um, planning cycles. Organizations are continually moving to integrated business planning because of the visibility and because it provides more insight. AI will continually evolve in terms of how it will be leveraged as part of the capital revenue ops, workforce, supply chains, cash flow, and other areas of business planning. You're not going to avoid it. It's just going to strengthen itself. The other fourth point on here is, and I've discussed this numerous times over my career, is Excel is not going anywhere, going away anytime soon. Plus, it's also licenses. A lot of companies have Microsoft 365. Um, they're going to only want to pay for licenses to the people that are actually doing the forecasting. They're going to end up providing some visualization of that number through other licenses in terms of viewer only. So you have to look at the right licensing model as well when you're looking at OLAP tools in Excel. The other thing is that it's a good mix. The companies that I've seen significantly investing high in Excel, I'm not saying other ones aren't, is Venus Solution is doing a high, that they get it in terms of finance is still going to leverage Excel, and they want to leverage that. Data Rails is a fairly new solution in terms of its relative space. It wasn't around when 2-3 years ago. Same with Cube and other solutions. So they're evolving. The other thing is you want a solution too that's highly supported. It's got a good roadmap. They're listening to you on it. It's easy to assess on model performance, but sometimes the intangible stuff on support. If you have a problem or a case and it takes forever to close that case, if you have a clunky user interface, it will have a problem with adoption as well. I'm going to mention scenario and gap analysis. Now, you can use gap analysis in different terms. It may be called something different. I've just referred to that because that's how I've always used it. Here's some additional links and information. Um, I basically have written a lot of things on that. I'm an expert, as I mentioned earlier, on close consolidation reporting. I've worked significantly on the FP&A side of leverage in different ways in data. With my 300 plus data and A deployment, each one of those deployments was different. And the reason I say that is because depending on the granularity, depending on what they're doing. Normally, typically what's happening over that, it's a phased in process. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll take the stuff out of Excel and put it in the lab. Or let's say they're moving from an on-prem system to the cloud, they'll do a shift and lift to the cloud. It's going to depend on where the client is in their FP&A process or on the board budgeting cycle. They could be selecting a new tool, they could be looking for an upgrade. It's just going to depend on that. So you need a well thought out business plan, and you need to collaborate and select the right business partner that can help you along your solution selection as well as supporting your solution over the long haul. Thank you very much and have yourself a wonderful day.